As a number of Chinese brands became competitive on the international markets, our second wave of growth essentially came from helping Chinese companies like Tencent, NetEase, ByteDance, or better known as TikTok, to globalize their products.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Slator Pod. Today on the podcast, we welcome Sijie Wei. He was recently appointed co-CEO of Language Technology Services and Game Localization Specialist, EC Innovations. Hi, Sijie, and thanks for joining today.
Hi, Florian. Thank you for having me.
So where do you record this from? What part of the world? What city?
I'm currently in Beijing, China.
There you go. Beijing, China. It's been a while since I was there. So tell us a bit about your professional background. You're from a different part of the professional world. You have you graduated in quantitative finance and computer science, and then tell us a bit more about your route into becoming the co-CEO of EC Innovations.
I guess that's a common question for me. It seems like a very disconnected world between quant finance and the language service space. But essentially 4 years ago, I was given a very interesting proposal by James, the original founder of the company. Basically, the role was to make the company global, make the company technology-driven, as well as to drive the funding and investment-related decisions of the company. So that was essentially what drew me to the company. And I think it took me quite a while for me to really understand what the business is about. But I think with the 4 years of experience now, I really see how actually the two industries are not that far apart. Maybe I'll give you some examples of this in our later conversation, but it's an interesting bridge into the next step of my career.
Absolutely. So I remember EC Innovations is one of the most formidable competitors in the mainland China market when I was based in Shanghai way back 10, 15 years ago. So just give us a bit of an overview of EC Innovations, clients, areas of expertise, your kind of geographic coverage and things like that.
EC Innovations primarily services industry leaders to help them unlock new markets in life sciences, games, finance and legal, AI, IT/e-commerce, manufacturing and automotives. So 50% of our clients are APAC based, and 50% of the rest are split evenly between US and Europe. So I think it's an interesting growth path for ECI. Primarily in the beginning, 27 years ago, the company founded to help essentially blue chip companies like HP, IBM, Siemens, SAP, to localize their products into China. So the Eastern heritage is very much a part of ECI's history. And then later on, 10 years later, as a number of Chinese brands became competitive on the international markets, our second wave of growth essentially came from helping Chinese companies like Tencent, NetEase, ByteDance, or better known as TikTok, to globalize their products.
That's a very interesting transition because, again, I remember I was based or I was doing a lot of business in mainland China, maybe late 2000s, then early 2010s. And I remember ECI as being this port of call for, as you said, the big global tech companies coming into China, right? And you had a very sophisticated kind of technology offering there already to help them with, complicated tech doc things and software localization. So when did you notice that there was kind of this move to add on top of servicing these kind of global companies into China to, then all of a sudden you had Alibaba and all these big companies, the domestic companies rising in China? And how difficult was it to get into these accounts kind of at that transitional period?
I think it naturally comes in view because I think ECI has always been a fairly macro-driven player, meaning I think this is where actually the growth of ECI, a company in the language space, compares with kind of investment in finance to some extent because I think the growth of ECI is very much macro-driven. So for example, that wave of IT companies globalizing, I think becomes a natural part of our growth path because we have already built all these capabilities servicing companies from the west to the east. And really to do it from the other way around is not intrinsically different. So naturally, we have the technology, we have the linguistic capabilities to help them. And it's really a matter of the market maturing enough for there to be an opportunity realized in that market segments. And I think it's quite natural that we started helping them. And now I think it's becoming a larger and larger part of the ECI's client base.
Yeah, it's a tough one though. I mean, it's super competitive also in the domestic mainland Chinese market to win these accounts. What are your thoughts on you mentioned APAC before, right? 50% of your business in APAC. What are your thoughts on kind of that Asia Pacific markets for language services and AI? In my view, at least, and I'm starting to disconnect a little bit from it, but like it seems that it's perpetually underserved, but also not quite living up to its potential that it's been, basically claimed to have for like 10, 20 years. So what are your thoughts on it?
I think it depends on the perspective, really. So from a Western LSP's perspective, APAC is going to be a difficult market to enter into because of cultural differences, because of proximity, all these things. And I think another important element is going to be the localization maturity in APAC. That is, I think, to some extent less than that of US or Europe. I think I read on Slator's annual reports that APAC represents around 20% of the globalization or localization services revenue globally. So I think my rationale for this is that historically the earliest buyers of localization are IT companies really in the West. So like the IBMs, SAPs from US or Europe. It's not until like a decade later then we started seeing companies in Japan or in China started going westwards. So fast forward to now, like while APAC has become a very big export market from a macroeconomics point of view, the localization maturity is still catching up to the speed of the growth of the markets overall. So that's why I think the market is still transitioning to more sophisticated products that require localization. And transitioning from providing labor and transitioning from providing like low barrier services to more high quality products. So from that perspective, I think the localization maturity level is still relatively low, and that's why I think it depends on the perspective, right? From one perspective, it's underserved and doesn't have realized as much of its potential, but on the other perspective, it just means there is more room for growth and more potential for it to catch up to the actual demand of the market.
Do you think there's also the potential for leapfrogging a bunch of what now, especially with AI, are becoming somewhat legacy workflows, right? I mean, if you're, I don't know, Vietnamese exporter into Indonesia, you may not set up the traditional localization workflow. You may try to just build it mostly based on AI. I don't know. I mean, just do you think there's kind of a theory that they might be leapfrogging and we're not even seeing it?
I think the maturity process still, to some extent, is required because, for example, it will be difficult to justify investment into AI, which is high barrier, compared to investment into automation of the process. So for example, CMS connectivity, like automation, workflow automation or process automation, like all of these are to some extent like lower hanging fruits for these companies versus AI. And without all these setup, right, that the US and European companies have been doing for years, I think that the AI component doesn't bring as much value to the process. So for example, if it's still a manual process to extract all the content from the website, you have to send an Excel sheet to whoever, whether the linguist or the AI company is that's going to do the translation itself. It seems like still not the right workflow, and you really don't get as much of the feedback and the real-time benefits of AI versus if all of that automation is already set up, then I think you get more realistic benefit from AI itself. So I personally don't think that leapfrogging is is going to be a likely state, but I could be wrong.
We briefly touched on the kind of the domestic China market, but is there anything substantial other than the big Chinese tech companies that are driving localization and translation and language AI demand in China? Is there like a second and third tier? And if yes, what is it? Like some of the manufacturers or, around maybe Guangdong area, etc.?
Many domestic Chinese brands are becoming international, and most notably is within the Belt and Road Initiative, so a lot of construction companies, also within verticals such as e-vehicle, or games, or actually a lot of AI companies. Like you'd be surprised about like how many of these AI companies that's internationally known are either founded like in China or like funded by Chinese investment. So I think all of those, from a macroeconomics perspective, there is a lot of export. So whether infrastructure building, e-vehicles, games, all of those verticals are seeing a lot of internationalization. And consequently, I think within the language space, you do get this consequential effects of, because of that such huge demand of internationalization, you then have the language service demands for those verticals. So very much, I think those are kind of some of the key verticals that is going to be growing out of China and out of APAC. And one other industry that's quite interesting is e-commerce, but I guess that's also kind of to some extent related to IT. So yeah, there are the main verticals in my mind.
Yeah, we just saw that Alibaba launched a new MT engine, or like a whole offering. I think it was called AI Edge or Age. It's hard to pronounce, but like a really sophisticated website. It kind of gives all the buyers and sellers like these tools readily available for them to go on the Alibaba marketplace. So that also shows that there's so much investment and research also going on in China in LLM-based translation. I mean, if you could pinpoint one country, it probably would be China in terms of just the level of focus on using LLMs for translation. I mean, we review a lot of these research papers that are coming out, and a lot of them are coming out of China. Like, hey, why do you think that is? And do you, as very company that's very strong in China, do you benefit from this? Like, what's the impact on you?
I think the rationale for that is, to some extent, cultural related. A lot of these IT giants in China want to develop their own solutions for pretty much everything instead of adopting a partnership model, which is more common in the West. So it's more common in the West to collaborate, say, oh, my core service or my core capabilities are within this area. Maybe I'm going to leave it to a language lab or a natural language research center to do all of these things. That's like kind of out of my core services. But actually, the way that many IT companies are structured in China is that they want to develop and they want to have a far reach into all verticals of capabilities. And that's why I think Alibaba, as you've mentioned, Tencent, NetEase, all of these IT companies, ByteDance also, are developing their language solutions. And that's why you see this really competitive space and a lot of research reports coming out of them. So where we see ECI positioning ourselves is still kind of on an implementation/application basis. So we take what is published in research papers, we try to experiment with different client contexts, and we try to see if there is a pragmatic way of adopting this latest research. Of course, some of them have open source models, some of them are just a theory, so we have to kind of implement ourselves. But all of these, I think that's to say, ultimately we leverage the latest research from these companies. And to some extent, I think it's really different from those researches from the West, because it's predominantly focused on Chinese as a language. And there are many intrinsic details that's going to be different. For example, tokenization, like between Latin language pairs or Romantic language pairs, it's different versus English, Chinese English, because the tokenization is going to be different. One of them is character driven and one of them is word driven. So again, not to go into too much details, but I think we leverage the latest industry research results, and we try to improve the processes that way.
Let's turn to game localization, which is something that you've invested quite heavily in. So tell us a bit first about the state of the global market for game localization, and then you acquired a Danish game localization company called Character Localization. So just tell us a bit more about the global market, and then maybe afterwards we talk about game localization, maybe more of a China view, but first global.
First off, before we get into kind of the global games localization space, we want to thank Slator again for helping us with the acquisition of Character. And for anyone that's looking for any acquisitions opportunities in the language space, I really give my full endorsement and recommendation for the team, because it was a very thorough process, and I think Slater's industry knowledge and connections made a huge difference here. But now to get back to your question about how we view the global games markets. So from a top level, especially from a publishing's perspective, I think it's an increasingly competitive market. You see, I think 27% more titles are released on Steam in 2023 compared to 2021, though the total market spend actually dropped by 15%. I think it's a legacy of kind of the trend after COVID. So based on that market observation, I'm pleasantly surprised that ECI games, among the current market correction, still saw like fairly good growth, which I think reflects if the product is good, there is still a high demand of it in the markets. But overall, I still have a fairly positive outlook on the games industry, because I think many different things are moving towards more gamification. I think games is becoming a very important medium for media and expression and creativity. And so I'm quite looking forward to how some of the new technologies and AI could potentially change the games landscape as a whole. Now, coming back to the Chinese markets, I think it's also exciting in that there's many notable games in the recent years that's published out of China. Genshin Impact from miHoYo as a example for how a mobile game can be really successful. And I think that encourages a lot of Eastern publishers or developers to really develop on their existing strength in the mobile space, and try to globalize their games that way. And there's also, I'm not sure if you heard, Black Myth Wukong recently was a very big thing for it's potentially a Game of the Year contender. And I think that gives a lot of inspiration for Chinese developers as well, or maybe APAC-based developers as well, to say that we also have capabilities of developing AAA quality games that could be really well received on an international basis. And I also think from a Western player base, they're quite the way that they're quite open to a new culture or a new history that was never reflected as much in the games space on a global scale. I think that's also interesting to observe. So overall, I think whether it's the global games markets or whether it's the Chinese games markets, I'm still quite positive on both of those markets.
How is it different to take a China developed game global than bring in a global developed game into China? I mean, if we just super basic framework like China versus global, global versus China, I mean, there's probably differences, of course, Japanese into, China, and then like maybe US or Europe, but like just the broad strokes, global into China, China to global.
I think that's an interesting question, because from our view, it's equally difficult to do both. Because it's not only the language side, right? Oftentimes, I think within our industry, we'll look very much at the language aspect of localizing a game, which is difficult by itself. But to commercialize the game successfully, I think there's other elements that could be still like encapsulated in the whole localization service, but it's not often considered. Often, like big games companies have just too much to worry about, so that they do kind of the minimal of what's required to get into another market space. But to be able to really cohesively represent a game well, I think it's equally difficult to bring a Chinese game global versus bring a global game to China. Because of player preferences, because different monetization methods, because of some of the game's mechanics could be intrinsically different. And I think perhaps one way the industry could potentially evolve is to not to grow from only looking at the language aspects to more kind of cultural consultation, as well as maybe even leaning towards a bit of kind of servicing fundamentally the publisher side on how to make a localization or a product localization successful in the game space. So a very top level answer to your question, but I think the industry overall is doing similar things for both directions, but I think there's minute details for each direction that is quite inherent to a game success, whether it's globalizing or localizing it to a market.
From a player's side, like, are there any fundamental differences, maybe even play time? I think in China there's like even some regulation for like up until a certain age, you can't play like for 8 hours in a row or something. Like, are there other differences?
I think primarily it's with monetization. So a lot of the Western games have, or the Western audience have a quite strong opinion on how a game should be monetized. And I think generally the Chinese player base is more forgiving in that sense. So in the beginning, you'll see a lot of mobile games that's really kind of ill-perceived in the West, because they're very much kind of intended to, for lack of a better words, to grab cash. And there's mechanics that's kind of designed specifically for that. So that was kind of the Chinese games scene like 10 years back. But then like with all these games that's successful on the international markets, those I think really set a good example of what kind of games could be successful. And they're successful not because they were successfully monetized, but they're successful because they tell an interesting story, their mechanics are interesting, they have a core gameplay loop that is interesting, and of course the localization of it is done well. And all of those factors I think contributes to the success. So again, to your question, many intrinsic player preference differences on monetization, on games mechanics. But overall, I think the barrier of entry is going to be lowered because players are going to be brought to more international games, and more and more of Chinese games are going to be internationalized as well.
Service in the game space requires really high level of expertise that goes beyond the language component, right? You mentioned it before, cultural, but also technology, workflow, etc. Now, ECI services a bunch of other verticals as well, right? I mean, finance, manufacturing, IT, software, SaaS, etc. How do you manage within the company to kind of keep those, to service those types of clients with the expertise required to win an RFP, for example? I mean, you need very niche knowledge. And also on the sales side, you're not going to win these if a game localization salesperson pitches a financial, an investment bank, it's going to be tough. So yeah, give us a sense of how you manage this individual kind of lines, or like how do you split the company to manage this?
Essentially, our business revolves around different verticals. So we operate in 8 different and separate business units. So the life sciences team, for example, would only do pharma, med devices, healthcare, but would not touch any of the games or finance projects, as you mentioned. ECI Games, as a dedicated sub-brand to ECI, would only work on games projects. Manufacturing only on manufacturing, and so on and so forth. So they each have some level of autonomy on a strategic level on what they want to do. So, for example, as we have been talking about games, ECI Games had the capability of developing, for example, audio, of art creation, of LQA, different capabilities within that business units. And that's really oriented around like what our current client base wants to do. And that level of autonomy on kind of making those decisions, I think it necessarily means that we sacrifice some level of resource sharing. So it does mean that like we cannot share a salesperson between two verticals, for example. But we feel like that's what's required on an organizational level to be conducive to the growth of our vertical and to be kind of more close to our clients and providing better services as such.
Does require a bit of scale though, right? So to achieve that. Now, you recently did a brand refresh, new website, everything, new logo, like a lot of language services, tech companies are probably looking at this right now in this like really rapidly moving environment with AI, etc. Do's, don'ts, risks, challenges. I don't know. I mean, it's always it's something that you have to do from time to time, but it's not easy to pull off, right? So tell us more about that.
So we actually started planning about the rebranding beginning of 2024, so beginning of this year, because we felt like the existing brand no longer fully captures what we do at TCI. So we initially spent a lot of time on deciding what really ECI is about, how we should position ourselves in today's markets, and what we aspire to be kind of in the near future, right? So it's a lot of ideation, prototyping, iterating over different copies and different designs. And actually, if there's one thing that we learned, it's probably like how much work is actually involved with a rebranding project, and how much we underestimated like what's involved. If we want to actually come off as organized, cohesive, then like there are so many things that needs to happen almost at the same time on the same day. The websites, the PowerPoints, the PowerPoint decks, the email signatures, the invoices, corporate letterheads, name cards. There's a whole list. I'm probably mentioning only half of, or maybe less than half of what actually changed. And within each one of those, it requires so many different parties' involvements. So, for example, invoices, like we kind of need to let our clients know to not be surprised by the new formats. The dev team needs to kind of reformat all the HTML codes to make sure it's represented accurately. A lot of testing goes into it. So again, we'll probably not do it again in the foreseeable future. It's a lot of work, but overall, I think it's inspired a lot of good engagement from the clients and a lot of good conversations. So I think it's worth it in the end.
How do you generate leads in like today's hyper competitive, kind of super noisy translation localization environment? How do you even cut through the whole AI? I mean, I don't know if I should call it hype, but just, I mean, it's basically on everybody's mind. And then you're coming in as a localization provider. How do you separate that? How do you cut through and generate leads?
I think objectively speaking, ECI has never been super strong at marketing. So I feel like I'm not necessarily in a good position to give advice on this, but I'll give my 2 cents. So I think our growth really comes from 2 major pillars. One of them is identifying the right growth verticals and really adamantly investing in those verticalized solutions for those markets. Because it's much harder to achieve growth in a macro space that is not growing. So it's much easier to grow when your solution is objectively superior to the rest of the markets, and it is also in the growth markets. So I think that's one which is really strategy focused. The second one is through our reputation, through our trustworthiness. Again, letting the product speaking for itself. So I definitely hear your point about like the noisy marketplace. Too often I hear about exaggerated statements of what AI can do to solicit attention. Will it bring leads in the short term? Probably. Is that a suitable long-term solution or a long-term sales strategy? I don't really think so. Again, I think it really depends on the solution. If the solution in a vertical is objectively superior, then I think the reputation will carry the company a long way. I think growing by word of mouth in the industry is still very much a thing, and that I guess cannot come from like over-representing or underselling the capabilities of AI in either direction.
So speaking of AI, do you see, or where is the expert in the loop currently within the ECI, I don't know, company, ecosystem, workflow? And where do you see it in 2-3 years from now? Let's skip to 5 years. Who knows what's going to be in 5 years, but 2 to 3 years.
One key challenge I see from the market, which you've mentioned also, is like there's such a vast spectrum of qualities and prices between the different AI, human, hybrid models. And I think among which consumers are really not ready to make a decision by themselves or not readily educated to make a contextualized decision. So it's a difficult challenge that we try to solve to integrate human and AI. But I think that's what's really going to push the industry forward. So we many times we don't really face a singular dimensional problem, which is deciding between human and machine, because it's very much content type driven. It's very much subject driven. It's even like different language pairs could have different performances, different use cases, and I think our expertise as an industry on the performance comparison between like human, AI, or a mixture, I think that's what's our intrinsic value for our client base. So I guess creating that level of clarity, whether through human consultation or whether through technology products, like I think in helping our clients make a contextualized decision, I guess provides providers in this space to be value driven in an increasingly commoditized markets. So I think again, ECI, I think we take a position of taking the most pragmatic approach. If AI can do it, we won't say like we need absolutely human. If AI cannot do it, we would absolutely recommend, based on our existing context and expertise, the best adoption of it. So yeah, I think there's going to be still a significant number of contexts in which, if client-side companies are already spending millions on making their product better, I don't see why they would choose AI over human, because they're still keep competing for every single competitive advantage they can. So I think there's still, at the end of the day, going to be a significant share of the market that is heavily reliant on quality. On others, it's all going to be efficiency driven.
Now, you were with Goldman Sachs back in your finance quant days. So if you put on your Goldman Sachs hat, like how do you view the investment landscape for maybe language AI companies on the one hand, but then the companies like ECI, AI driven localization? How do you see the investment landscape currently?
I think currently in the markets, the valuation reflects uncertainty and risk averseness. So you'll generally see the multiples in the space relatively lower compared to previous years. And I think companies or AI-driven companies like ECI are yet to prove to the investors that AI could be adopted and at scale in a commercialized fashion. So I think the industry is still working quite hard on doing this. On the other hand, I think among these current valuations, I believe there's specific outliers in the markets that's potentially going to be heavily undervalued, because investors don't have enough time to do the due diligence on understanding, this market is potentially highly resilient to AI. This market space is more prone to be replaced or to a certain percentage by automation and AI and whatnot. So I think there are going to be companies that's undervalued in this space. So yeah, I do believe there's going to be opportunities for the investors that's going to be more willing to learn about our industry and kind of dive in a bit deeper. At the same time, also thinking there are really super capable companies that's either providing really high quality services and highly resilient to AI, or there's companies that have a potential of adopting AI in a full and full implementation that could be potentially highly valued in the future.
I tend to agree. I mean, I think the current view is almost like everything's going to get eaten by AI in the next 2 years. That's kind of the valuation basis it feels currently. Anybody who's even remotely perceived as service is getting kind of put into that bucket. And I don't think rightly so, but it's very, very hard to determine the winners, and those are going to be those that are going to be challenged much more, right? So, I mean, the winners, as you rightly point out, are probably undervalued at this point in time. Because if you get through that next couple of waves of AI innovation and you end up being somebody who puts that application or service layer on top of these incredible technologies, then yeah, you're set for a great future. Tell us about next year. What's in your roadmap now? You just finished the rebranding. I'm sure you're happy about it, that this is passed and all the footers and name cards and things like that are adjusted. So now you can go and focus back on product and services and potentially international expansion. So tell us a bit more about what's in store for next year.
I think we look at it from two different angles. In spaces where AI is relevant and in context where we feel like AI can actually be of real help for our end clients, it's really about a race of adoption, right? Who can bring a better product, who can deliver the most accurate and efficient product to the markets. I think we'll be seeing the most growth in the next year or two. And for other contexts where human is superior, I think we're still quite adamant about our quality, because I think in this space, there is even more important than ever to differentiate quality-driven products than efficiency-driven products. Because I think if the client is going to look for competitiveness in quality in their end products, then they would not want any anything inferior, anything that is potentially done by AI, because in most contexts, still human outperforms AI. I would say in 99% of the scenario. So I think as long as that's true, those are kind of the two pillars of our focus. One is more efficiency and one is more quality driven.
All right, Sijie, thank you so much for taking the time today and joining Slator Pod.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Florian.